The first thing I want to do is remove the wheel, so take off all 5 of your lug nuts with a 21mm socket. Now take the wheel off. If it's stuck on here, go ahead and put a lug nut back on so it doesn't fall off, and then use a rubber mallet and hit it from the backside. That should pop it right off. Take the lug nut off now that the wheel is free. Go ahead and wiggle it off of here. All right, take the wheel off. And now with the wheel off, I'm going to take the cotter pin out of this upper ball joint, straighten it out as much as possible, and try to remove it. Sometimes it's too rusted and can't be removed, in which case you can just cut it flush with the nut and then just take the nut off over the cotter pin, and we'll have to drill it out. In this case, looks like I'm able to get it out of here, which is good. There it is. Now take a 21mm socket and remove this castle nut. Leave it on a few threads. Then we're going to use a hammer right here on the knuckle, and that's going to pop the ball joint free off of the knuckle. There it goes. Now I want to remove the axle nut. I'm going to take this cotter pin out. Now take off this little cover, and then with a 36mm socket, we can remove the axle nut. Make sure that the axle pushes through. If it's seized in here, use a hammer and punch it through. I'm going to take a pry bar, pry down on this control arm so that I can remove the nut completely. And then once I let up on the control arm, be careful because several things are going to happen. One, the knuckle's going to want to come forward, and two, the axle's going to want to pull out of the knuckle. So make sure you pay attention to both of those things. Don't let the knuckle go too far. You don't want to extend your brake hose too far. I'm going to push the axle through. There we go. Let the knuckle come forward. I'm going to take off the two 18mm caliper mounting bolts so I can get the caliper off so I can move this knuckle further out. Probably should have done this before, but sometimes you can get away without doing it. I guess not this time. I'm going to leave this one in temporarily. Take off the caliper. I'm going to set it up on top of the upper control arm. Before I move further, I want to take off the ABS wire, and if you follow it up, you can see it's hooked on in a few different places. This is one of them. This is what the clip looks like from the backside. It actually has an 8mm bolt there that we have to remove. All right, now this is free. If you keep following it up, it's attached to the brake hose over here. Pop this off. Follow it up even more, and you'll see that it goes up in here on the fender liner. Remove the wiring harness. And if you pull it down, you'll see the connector over here. Press the tab and disconnect it. Remove your ABS wire. The next thing I want to do is remove the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. I'm going to take out this cotter pin. Thankfully, looks like mine is not seized in here, so I can maybe take it out a nice way. Usually they're completely stuck and you'll have to cut them. Grab your 22mm socket and remove this nut. Take your hammer on the knuckle until the stud for the tie rod pops through. Next, I want to remove the lower ball joint nut, so I'm going to take out this cotter pin. Well, mine is not coming out, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a chisel and a hammer, flatten it out, or cut it flush, so I can put a socket right over and take the nut off over the cotter pin. 24mm socket, remove this nut. Watch out because there's nothing holding this knuckle in anymore at this point other than the pressure of it being stuck on here. So I'm going to put this nut back on, a few threads, then I'm going to hammer on the knuckle right here, and this will hopefully break it free, make it fall down off of the ball joint. There we go. Now you can remove the nut, pull the knuckle down, and remove your knuckle, set it aside, and now we can work over here. A couple things have to happen before this ball joint actually comes out. One is we have to remove the snap ring, otherwise it'll never come out. And I'm going to spray it down with some rust penetrant, which will hopefully help it to break free. Stick a pry bar in here, see if I can spread it apart a little bit. There we go. All right, so it is breaking free. That's great, because sometimes they're seized on there and you have to kind of hammer it with a chisel. Now you want to get your snap ring pliers in here. Make sure that they grip into the little holes properly, because if you strip these out, you're gonna, well, not have so much fun taking this out. Take this out, and then what I want to do is remove this grease fitting here, because I need to have a flat surface to hammer on. Whether I'm, you can use a ball joint press too, but whatever you do, you need to have a flat surface, either for your hammer or your ball joint press. And now at this point, I'm going to take my large hammer and I'm going to hammer this down till the ball joint pops through. There it goes. So to press the new ball joint in, it'll have to press in from the bottom to the top, and obviously you can't press on the stud or on the boot here. So what you have to do is get your ball joint press with a couple adapters here. I have a cup and then a flat piece that the ball joint press is going to hold up against, just like this. And then at the top, I need something flat. So what I have here is this cup that's larger than the hole, and you want that so that the ball joint can protrude up into the receiving cup at the top. Tighten up your ball joint press. Now, when you're pressing from the bottom here, you want to make sure that you're pressing on the outer lip of this ball joint, definitely not on the boot or on the stud like I mentioned before. So make sure you get the proper sized cup. Now I'm going to take my tool and tighten this down. That's going to suck the ball joint up into the control arm until it is completely bottomed out. Here we go. All right, that's it. As you can see, it's completely seated. It's pressed up against the control arm on the bottom, and you can see the snap ring groove. That's important because the snap ring is what's going to completely lock it in. And speaking of snap ring, let's go ahead and put the brand new snap ring in. Try to avoid reusing the old one if possible. Your ball joint should come with a new one though, so that should not be an issue. Make sure it is completely seated around. You don't want this to pop off and lose your ball joint while you're driving down the road. That would be very dangerous. At this point, I want to get the knuckle back in, so I'm going to slide it over this lower ball joint. Okay, I have the nut over here. Put on the nut so I can let go of it, because it's pretty heavy. Now I'm going to take my axle, make sure it has anti-seize on the splines here. Mine already does. And I'm going to press it in, stick it into the knuckle. There we go, that lines up. Perfect. Push the knuckle in. And now we have to line it up with the upper control arm. Take my pry bar, stick it in here, pry this down. Okay, press it down. Once it lines up and the threads come through, go ahead and start your nut on so you can let go. I'm going to thread it on as much as possible by hand. That way it has good thread engagement. Don't have to worry about it popping off. Definitely don't leave it in just one or two threads. That's not enough. Now let's tighten up this upper ball joint nut and then we'll torque it. 76 foot-pounds is the torque for this. And now you want to continue tightening to line up the slot for the cotter pin. Mine actually happens to perfectly line up. You can't see it, but it's in there. So I'm just going to stick my cotter pin through, just like so. And of course, bend it over to lock it in. Now it's time to get the rotor back on. If your hub is dirty or rusty, you want to go ahead and clean this down. Mine's already sanded down and I have anti-seize applied to it. You want to do the same thing. And of course, same to the back side of the rotor. Right over here, I have a new rotor, so I don't have to worry about it, but if you're reusing your old one, make sure it's clean. You want to have a nice flat mounting surface for this, because if it's not, it'll sit slightly at an angle and you'll have issues going down the road. I'm going to put a lug nut on just to hold the rotor in place temporarily. Now let's put on the axle nut, snug it up, and torque it to 254 foot-pounds. I'm going to use my air gun to snug it up because it'll be way faster, but I won't be tightening it with it. It's important not to do that because you don't want to over-tighten it. It'll put too much preload on the bearing and it'll wear out prematurely. Again, 254 foot-pounds is the torque for this. I'm going to stick a pry bar in between the lug studs like this to prevent the hub from spinning as I try to tighten it. That's it. Now grab your caliper and let's slide it over the rotor. I have a bolt ready so that as soon as it lines up, I can thread it in and then let go of it because it's not very light. Okay, that one started. Put in this one at the bottom as well. Bottom them out, and then we'll torque them to 136 foot-pounds. And 2. Now let's tighten up and torque the lower ball joint. Bottom it out. And the torque for this is 112 foot-pounds. That's it right there. And at this point, you want to make sure that the slot for the cotter pin lines up. For me, it almost does, so I'm going to keep tightening. You don't want to loosen to make it line up. Always tighten. Now grab your cotter pin, slide it through, and of course bend it over to lock it in. Now let's get the tie rod back into the knuckle, press it down, put the nut on, bottom this out, and then torque it to 76 foot-pounds. If your cotter pin hole does not line up with the slot in the castle nut, keep tightening, don't loosen to get it to line up. Right there is perfect. Get a cotter pin in, slide it through, and bend it over to lock it in. Let's resecure our ABS wire. Nice and snug. Now let's go ahead and plug it in. Make sure it clicks, and let's resecure it. Make sure the wire goes behind the control arm here, above the shock tower. Push it in. Perfect. Let's put the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts and torque them to 150 foot-pounds. That is if you have the 5 lug wheel pattern. If you have 7 lugs, then you want to torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Double check them. There you have it.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.